Thank you so much. I think this mic is on. Yay. I'm so happy to be at the College of the Oaks. This is amazing. I should have gone here. Why didn't somebody tell me this decades ago? And so it's amazing, and I've heard about your acorns when you come here and your saplings when you leave. I just can't wait to hear about all these oak trees around the world. So maybe later you can tell me some stories. I'm really, really thrilled to give you a little bit of storytelling tonight about forest canopies and how it's been as a woman scientist in a man's world of field biology. But first of all, I have to ask you a question. Raise your hand if you've ever climbed a tree. Woo, look at that. Now, don't look if you're faculty. Raise your hand, students, if you've climbed a tree on this campus. Oh my gosh, that's so great. There's some beautiful ones out there. I think you could have a little class in tree climbing probably, and maybe we'll talk later about a Canopy Walkway, because it could be a really cool thing for this oak campus that you have. Anyway, I work now at the California Academy of Sciences, and that's actually a museum. It's the Smithsonian of the West, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, and I'll especially highlight it because right now I'm recruiting women in science for our staff. We've had 8% women scientists when I arrived, and now we're up to 21%, and we're really hoping to get a little closer to the global average, which would be 50 or 51%. So stay tuned as I doggedly have to really kind of figure out how we can make more equity in some of these major institutions around the world and around the country. So here's the lady of the day. You know, think about that. Poor old Marie Curie, every picture of her, right, is surrounded by men. Maybe that's kind of cool, but she doesn't look very happy about it. We have a history of looking back in our textbooks and reading about women in science where usually there are only a handful of women that people know about, and there are many more examples that are men. When I taught Environmental Studies 101 as a college professor, I always asked my students on the first day, please list 3 women scientists and 3 male scientists. And they would hand in their piece of paper with the list of 6. And literally, almost all of the women side of the page was nothing. A few students always put Meg Lowman, because I think they wanted an A in the class. You know, they didn't know what else to say. A few put Rachel Carson, and a few put Marie Curie, but we still don't have kind of a overall overwhelming number of women in our textbooks and as role models for a lot of us who have gone into the field of science. So given that there are 51% women on the planet, I think it's part of my responsibility as a scientist now to think about how to recruit those women. And I want to give you a few examples of countries around the world where I've been working on my own research and also trying to embrace the issues of getting local women engaged as environmental stewards. So here's my job. This is what I do when I go to work. I think my children thought I was pretty weird because my briefcase had a rope and a harness and a slingshot, whereas most people have a computer and all sorts of really cool pens and notebooks or something. But this is the gear that I use for my work, studying the tops of trees. And I only really came upon all of this business of looking in the canopy when I started getting interested in leaves. And when you think about it, around here in North Carolina, it's pretty simple. The leaves fall off the tree, probably October, and then they come back again the next April. So you know exactly how long leaves live on beech trees and dogwood trees and all of those things. But in the rainforest, it's green all year round. So how long do those leaves live? Anybody know the answer to that? How long does a tropical leaf live in a rainforest? Shout out a number. 30. Yes! How'd you know that? Oh. Did you read my book? Anyway, actually over 20. This was amazing to me. I should never have done this for my PhD thesis. I thought it was going to be 2 years or 3 years, but in some cases, leaves in the tropics did live as long as 20 years, which was pretty awesome compared to 6 months in the temperate zone. So over the course of time, I've been able to ask a lot of questions about forests just because I was crazy enough to climb the trees. And today, we now know that forests keep us alive. So this makes work on forests and forest canopy is really, really important to the future health of humans, not just the trees themselves. So this is where I grew up. Upstate New York, in a rural part of the country where I had, let's see what we've got there. We've got red maple, and we've got white birch, and we've got sugar maple, and all sorts of trees, probably very similar to what you have here. And this was kind of my backyard. I did not have a Smithsonian, and I didn't have a California Academy of Sciences, but I had this really cool museum called The Backyard. And so all of my love of nature came from playing outside. And as I told a couple of the students earlier today, a funny few things happened to me when I was a kid. First of all, I was a total geek. My friends all made fun of me because I really loved nature. And I even loved to collect plants. And you know what I used to do? I would press the plants in something called a telephone book. And when I go to elementary schools and I tell them that, they go like, Dr. Lowman, how did you put the plants in your iPhone? You know, because that's your telephone book. But when I was a kid, we had these great big paper things called telephone books, and they were perfect for pressing plants. And here I am in 5th grade, taking my plant collection to the science fair in New York State. And seriously, I was about the only girl there. There were about 500 students, and 499 were boys, mostly with their volcano experiments. Remember those things? Put the vinegar on, whew. Anyway, I was so nervous, I was so shy, and amazingly enough, I got a second prize for my little wildflower collection, a plastic trophy about this big. I think it cost 50 cents. But oh, I was so proud. I think my mother thought I was equivalent to Marie Curie. Little did she know, but at least it kind of gave me some sense that maybe I could do science even as a girl, which was kind of amazing. And the other funny thing that happened to me was because I was a geek and my friends all made fun of me, I didn't have too many friends to play outdoors with. So I did have one girlfriend named Betsy, and we made these tree forts together. And by the way, I didn't own a camera when I was little, so this is not my tree fort. In fact, I don't have any pictures of my tree fort because I didn't have a camera. But if you Google tree fort or tree house, this one comes up. It's in Hollywood. It's really cool, isn't it? So I'd really like to meet the owner of the treehouse if you know who they are. But anyway, there's some awesome tree houses in the world now, mainly built in movie stars' backyards and sometimes in parks. But we made these pretty rough things, and we tried very hard to rescue birds that had fallen out of their nests and things like that. And the reason I told you this story is I love trees, so I made these little tree forts. Betsy rescued the birds, and she became a nurse following in her passion. And the funnier thing is, her brother, whose name was Tommy Hilfiger, loved to sew clothing. And so he was always sewing on his mother's sewing machine in high school, and we were out playing with nature. So the moral of the story is you really should follow your passion, because maybe someday you could grow up and be Tommy Hilfiger. Maybe on the other hand, you could just become a scientist studying trees. But in any case, think hard. It's really, really critical, I think, that you think about what you love, and hopefully you'll get to execute that a little bit. That was my geek picture because, as I mentioned, it was always a little embarrassing to be one of these kids that like nature so much. So taking this love of trees and love of nature, I actually went to Australia after a lot of different hurdles at different levels in my education, because I got a scholarship to study the rainforest at Sydney University in Australia, and I was really excited about that. When I arrived, nobody at the University of Sydney even studied the rainforest. Nobody had ever studied the rainforest, and my advisor studied eucalyptus trees. And I said, well, how am I gonna find a rainforest? I've never even seen one in my life. He said, just drive north, and when it turns green, you know you're in the rainforest. And it was 1,200 miles from Sydney to drive to Queensland to get into the rainforest. So I did a lot of driving, and along the way, I did create this method of taking ropes and harnesses, and I made that harness actually from seatbelt webbing, and I made a slingshot from a piece of metal that I forged in the shop at the university, and lo and behold, climbed up in the tree. And the amazing thing is to think about, you know, this is pretty weird because everybody has a backyard, and a lot of people have trees in their backyard. And lo and behold, when I got to the top of these trees in Australia, it turns out that 50% of the biodiversity on our planet lives in the tops of trees. And it was all because of doing this little bit of harness and rope thing that I got up there and found out all these cool creatures were up there. So this is how it looks. That's actually Bob Ballard that worked with me for quite a few years. You can use things like harnesses like this, like a sling to come up and down. You can use pulleys, you can use ropes and carabiners and the hardware that mountaineering people use, like right there. There's any number of ways you can add ladders and tree platforms into your combination. But the neat thing is this very simple method that's pretty cheap allowed me to climb thousands of trees around the world and lo and behold, find out that all of these amazing creatures that keep the forest alive are living in the tops of trees. So now from this simple little methodology, we can all agree and say that, guess what? 50% of the biodiversity on land lives in the tops of trees. And this is kind of scary to think about because, you know, in the 1950s, we got scuba gear developed by some very cool aquatic people, and that opened up coral reefs for exploration. In the 1960s, we went to the moon, and NASA opened up outer space exploration, but it wasn't really until the 1980s that we started exploring the tops of trees. So that makes it one of the newest frontiers of exploration, and probably of those 50% of species on Earth, we know less than 5%. So there's a whole lot of discovery. If you're interested in climbing, come and see me after this talk. And it's pretty incredible that we're losing all of these species before we even know what they are. And you can probably figure out what a lot of them are. Anybody know what that one is in the top left? Koala. I know they're so cute. And the most common things in the world in the canopy is the beetle, of course, and lots of plants and lots of cool birds like this frigate bird and ants galore, and of course plenty of reptiles and amphibians. So the canopy is this amazing, extraordinary place where all of these animals are up there mainly because all the leaves are there. It's like a salad bar in the sky, and they're really excited to eat the leaves and eat the animals and eat the animals that eat the animals and so on and so forth. So this is a little bit about how this world of mine called Canopy Research has been developed over the years. This is how people used to study the canopy. It's kind of really weird to think about this, but a forest in the tropics is about 200 feet high, and yet people always walked through it. So they really only studied the first 6 feet. It would be kind of like you going to the doctor and he looks at your big toe and says, oh, you're perfectly healthy. Your vision is perfect, your ears are perfect, your mouth is perfect, your brain is perfect, just by looking at your big toe. For 200 years, foresters had walked through forests and made all of their conclusions based on this kind of tunnel vision through the bottom of a forest. And this is about as high up as you would ever get a sample, which was reaching on top of a fence or something like that. So lo and behold, after developing these ropes and harnesses early on in 1979, as I indicated earlier in that slide, the second tool that I was part of creating is called a Canopy Walkway. And this was a chance to allow a group of people to be in the treetops together. Because if you have a rope, you can only have one climber, right? If you have 2 or 3 of you on one rope, you're likely to fall because maybe the rope will break or the branch will break because you're too heavy. So building these walkways became a wonderful way to let a whole class of people study in the canopy or to go in the canopy during the rain or at night because it was much safer to walk along these bridges. And so this is the first one built in Queensland, Australia. Anybody ever been there? Oh my gosh, that's so cool. Little reunion later. This is outside of, it's in Lamington National Park outside of O'Reilly's Guest House, and it was built in 1985, and that allowed us to really do cool work on the canopy, especially the insects, because this was one of these really crazy factoids that I learned along the way, but when I climbed in the daytime, I never saw any insects, and yet the tree was so full of defoliation. The leaves were absolutely ripped apart by insect jaws. So why do you think I never saw any insects by day? They were nocturnal. And why would they be nocturnal? Yeah, it was so simple, because they're avoiding being eaten by birds. So think about it. If you're an insect, you would much rather feed at night than by day. So one of those overwhelmingly hit you over the head kind of facts. After climbing and climbing and climbing by day, I finally realized I had to climb by night. But in a lot of forests, it's a little dangerous to climb at night. So sometimes we would build these walkways instead where we could work at night, and it was a lot easier to do that. So along all of these adventures of building walkways and climbing with ropes, I had 2 babies. I got married to a sheep and cattle rancher in Australia, and so this became the ratio of choice. I was always one of 1 or 2 women on expeditions, mostly men, and the other thing is because there was no daycare in Australia and there was no family for me within about 10,000 miles, because my family was all over here in upstate New York. I always had to take my children on field trips. So that was a real riot, let me tell you. But, you know, feeding the baby, going out in the field, coming back, giving the baby a nap, and doing this and that. But fortunately, I had a really good advisor. That's Joe Connell from the University of Santa Barbara, California. And he was the mastermind of a great big rainforest project that I was part of. And yet I was the only female participant on this project. So I was always juggling this kind of bifurcation of my brain, you know, one half bringing the toys and the diapers, and the other half identifying the seedlings in the rainforest trees and collecting the data. So we have now a whole suite of these canopy walkways. Besides in Australia, we have walkways in almost all the major countries of the world that have tropical forest. This is in the Amazon. I talked to some of you already, and every July I take a group of students down here, and there's a few of them in this audience that are Elon students. I'm so happy. And so anybody who ever has a passion for rainforest canopies, you might want to come in July, not this summer, it's already full, but 2017, we've already got the date set for July 24th. And it's about an 8-day trip, and I bring a bunch of citizen scientists, and we survey along this walkway, which is really long. It's about almost 1 kilometer long, and we can sample all the insects feeding on the leaves. We can sample the tarantulas living in the bromeliads, and we can sample the orchids and the vines and the plant growth. So there's a huge number of things that we can do with this fantastic trail up in the sky that we couldn't do if we went up and down on the ropes all day. The other tool in my toolkit, in addition to ropes and walkways, is this construction crane. And this one's kind of funny because you know what happens with construction cranes when they get old and kind of rusty in the US. Did you ever wonder what construction companies do with them? So I guess the answer is they give them to scientists, and we take all the old ones and we take them into the tropics. This one is in Panama, and they make a fantastic little gondola car that you can use to sample everything within the arm of this crane. So you're restricted. You can't go outside of that boundary, but you can really do extensive work on things like photosynthesis, or maybe measuring leaf miners or fungi on the leaves. So it's a really good tool for certain kinds of questions, but not for all kinds of questions. And so here's how it looks riding in this amazing car. You don't have to get sweaty. You don't have to worry about all sorts of things that you worry about when you're on a rope, but it's a really comfy ride, but it's a more limited method for surveying. And finally, in my toolkit, the last major piece of gear that we've designed over the years is using inflatables to study in the tops of trees, because with this we can go over the canopy, which is really important for a lot of things. So this is the hot air balloon, and this is the actual raft that you'll see in a minute that we're about to position over here on the top of that tree. And in many of these expeditions with the hot air balloon, I've usually been the only female. Here is Cameroon, Africa, as that slide indicates, 49 men and 1 woman. So it was always a little bit disappointing that there weren't more women in my field in the old days. But this is the most fun thing to do in the world. It's like being in the Wizard of Oz or something, but it's really very cool. There I am in the top of this little trawling thing, and we're collecting vines, as you can see. In a minute, we're gonna go scrunching up to this canopy tree, and we're gonna be able to sample all of the insects with our nets, and we're gonna be able to clip all the flowering parts of the vines in the canopy that are very much at the top of the tree with this kind of equipment. So it's a really amazing toolkit to use for doing the very uppermost canopy parts of the rainforest. And it's only a simple apparatus with a little bit of a hot air balloon flame and a driver who hopefully is pretty good about angling you up to the trees without too much trouble, and hopefully not into any ant nests or any vine snakes hanging in the canopy or something like that. But mostly really safe and really, really very fun. So that's been, for me, my most amazing moment, is using this hot air balloon, which is always part of a big expedition, which unfortunately has always been very much women in the minority. So maybe in future we can change that a little bit. Here's how it looks in the actual raft that we use. You can see me coming up right here at about 1 o'clock from a rope on the ground. And this whole thing is like a trampoline, so I can walk around it. I can sample leaves. I can dangle over the edge with my harness and rope and sample the mid-canopy as well. So over time, now that we have the toolkit, we have to say, okay, we can study all the forest canopies of the world, but we have this big problem. We're losing these canopies. We're losing all these rainforests. Sometimes in science, it's a little crazy. We get blinders on and we forget about the fact that we've really got to look after the conservation side of the forests, not just the science itself. So I did write a book about my, what I call misadventures in the canopy, because of juggling babies and science and different gender problems and cultural issues, which are abounding when you study in places like Africa. But anyway, so the book, the good news is that the book was very well received as one of the first books that was written by a woman about tropical rainforests. So I was really happy to break down that barrier. And the other surprising thing to me was that I didn't think about, it got translated into a lot of different languages. And we sometimes take it for granted that most people could read books that are in English. But last year I went to Taiwan to christen with break the ribbon for the first Canopy Walkway in Taiwan, and I was swarmed by all these women that had read my book in their language and actually were in graduate school studying biology because they knew that they could. So I think another piece of advice to you, in addition to following your passion, is we need to make our resources available for other women in their language, using examples in their culture. We have to be really sensitive, I think, to thinking harder about how we can share our resources with women in other countries to make sure that they can benefit from role models and they can benefit from some of the tools that we take for granted. And along the way, of course, I had my children to contend with, and that became an asset, not a disadvantage. There's kind of jokes in my lab when I was younger about, well, is Meg gonna leave the boys at the bottom of the tree with the poisonous snakes, or is she gonna allow them to climb the tree and risk their lives? And I guess you know the answer to that, because here they are with their harnesses at age 4 and 5 in Belize, which was their first real climbing rainforest. But they did come with me on field trips ever since they were born, and they became really great counters of bugs and measures of leaves. So along the way, we developed quite a good bit of teamwork. In my second book that I wrote, they actually co-authored with me, because that's what you always do as a scientist, is you co-author with your best research assistants or lab assistants. So they were my really great, intrepid field scientists. So we had a lot of fun with that. Sometimes a little frantic, but I have a lot of advice. If any of you ever decide you want to go on that path of taking your children into the field with you, you can call me for all of my little bits and pieces of advice. And we had some fun along the way. James was so mad on that trip because he missed his first ever New Year's Eve party with his friends at school. But guess what? He learned how to use that blowgun. And he came back and he was the coolest kid in his 5th grade class because he knew how to use a blowgun. So sometimes there's advantages of traveling with your mom. So now we have walkways, we have hot air balloons, we have ropes, we have all the tools that we need. And so I just want to walk through a couple examples of how we can, as scientists, maybe leverage our toolkit in a slightly different way, not just answering questions about science, but maybe applying our science and our tools to global good. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how walkways for me have become a really important tool for helping to save forests, not just to answer questions. This is the walkway in Mayaca, Florida. For any of you who haven't been to the only public canopy walkway in North America, this is it in Mayaca River State Park. But I'm going to take you to Samoa for an example of how walkways could really save a forest. And in this case, a colleague of mine who's an ethnobotanist, he studies medicines and plants, named Paul Cox, called me up and he said, you have to come with me to Western Samoa because we have a big problem. And he said, we've discovered a plant that has antiviral quality. We want to use it for AIDS research, but it's on an island where the chiefs need $53,000 to build a cement school for their children, and they really want the school, and they've been offered $53,000 to cut down their trees to pay for the school. So this was a big dilemma for these chiefs. They love their kids, they love the education that their kids need to receive, and yet they love their forests because all their ancestors are wrapped up in the spirit of the forest. So Paul had this idea that maybe I could convince them to build a canopy walkway and we could create an income stream from it. So to thank us for coming, they invited us to the tattoo ceremony, which was one of the first times they'd ever had Westerners invited. Anybody out there have a tattoo? Ooh-wee, that's kind of cool. Thank you for admitting it. I want to tell you a cool story, especially if you're a guy, but in Samoa, they have the full body tattoo, but only some men have them. And so I asked one of the women, I said, why would men get this? It is so painful. We saw this ceremony and I nearly threw up because they were going through so much pain when the piranha teeth pound the juice of the Alurites tree into their skin to make these real natural tattoos. And the woman said to me, well, in our culture, we believe that childbirth is the most painful thing to experience in the whole wide world, but getting a whole body tattoo is the next most painful thing. So a man with a tattoo makes the best husband. So keep that in mind, girls and boys. If you have a tattoo, maybe your parents will forgive you or something. So this was really cool, and we were flattered to be invited to this ceremony, but our real mission was, of course, talking to the chiefs about this idea. Could we convince them that building a canopy walkway might lead to an income stream through ecotourism was something they'd never heard of before. So we sat cross-legged for about 7 hours while they chanted in Samoan, and we drank this plant called the kava, which is a hallucinogenic plant, and the chiefs got happier and happier, and so did we, and every once in a while they'd say monkey woman and they'd point to me and laugh, so we knew they were on task with the topic. But by the end of the day, they had agreed to take this amazing chance that they would build a canopy walkway, that we would get them a loan for $53,000, and they would build it in their most beautiful fig tree, and lo and behold, in 2 years, they paid back the loan for $53,000. The students from the school would take the tourists on the tour of their canopy, and they were so profitable that they could create scholarships for their best students to go off the island when they finished grade 7 and go to high school at the nearby high school. So this is one of several cases now where we use these walkways to collect our science information, but we also turn them over to the local people in hopes that they can create an income that doesn't require cutting down their trees. And so there have been quite a few of these, and it's been really fun to see how canopy science can contribute to conservation. Another automatic way, I think, to conserve forests is through all of you. So for me as one scientist, I can't do a whole lot, but if I can inspire students, obviously I can do a lot more. So this was one of my most fun experiences in my career as an educator, and that was working with that guy in the video that I showed you, Bob Ballard, who discovered the Titanic and wanted to share that feeling of discovery with kids. And so he and I teamed up and we actually worked in rainforests on odd years and marine environments on even years to go in and do virtual field trips hooked up through satellite telecommunication to schools and millions of kids around the world. We could broadcast our discoveries in the field. This is one of the broadcasts from the Amazon. And we had wires. This was the good old days. This was the late 1990s and the early 2000s where we had a lot of it. We had 5 miles of wire at one point through an Amazon forest, taking us to the satellite dish on a barge in the Amazon that would then send the signal up and down to Texas and over to Australia and this, that, and the other. So through distance learning, through bringing young people to the rainforest, I think we can make a huge difference as scientists. And if all of us can share our knowledge with young people, not just college students, even though you guys are pretty cool, but if we can reach middle school students and high school students, I think we'll really make a difference much more effectively in trying to get global good achieved for forest conservation. So I also want to touch on women, as I mentioned before, and for that I want to take you to India because I've worked quite a lot in India and I have some amazing women students in India. And of course, India is on the cusp of explosion. They've got our cell phone technology, they've got our computer technology, they don't quite have the healthcare and they don't quite have the different kinds of modern conveniences like good roads and great GPS to get around the country, but they have extraordinary wildlife like tigers and elephants and really amazing trees and really fantastic medicinal plants. So it's a very important country for us to focus on. And when I work in India now, I try really hard to think about how I can have a positive impact on the women that I meet. And this is really what a lot of the women are doing in rural India. They're finding food for their families. They're going into wetlands to get fish. They're doing very backbreaking labor to grow plants in their gardens and collect water. So it's really not very easy for them to make a transition to being a student like some of you. And so the best thing for me to do as a scientist when I go to India, I've decided in my own little heart, is to try to be a mentor to as many women as possible. So I've been lecturing for groups of women when I go to India, and believe it or not, even taking extra pairs of khaki pants and teaching women to climb trees, because that is really empowering for them. And then they think, gosh, maybe I can do this too. So the more places that we can be in developing countries, giving women tools and opportunities to use their amazing IQs as part of the global science solution, I think the better off we'll be for not just forest conservation, but maybe for a lot of things in general. Okay, so my last but not least case study is using the church to save forests. And usually my colleagues kind of scratch their head and go, that's impossible. Religion and science are opposites, they never go together. But I've been working in Ethiopia, and the amazing and cool part of this story is that it's because of the Coptic priests, because of the church, that I've been able to have an impact on forest conservation in this country. So here's Ethiopia, eastern part of Africa, and it's got 90 million people, and it's got an incredibly subsistence agriculture, and unfortunately, very little of its forests left. This is shopping on Saturday. This is how Ethiopians go to Walmart for the most part, and they're surely not going to Walmart, but they're going to their market. They're trading all of their goods, and they're coming home with other goods, but most of them don't have shoes, and most of the women don't have umbrellas. It's very prestigious if you get an umbrella, and they definitely don't have water bottles in their satchels, and they don't have any place to stop. And use facilities along the way. So most of these people are walking distances up to 15 miles to go shopping on Saturday and then walking home again without shade. And so here's an aerial of northern Ethiopia. Can you see the forests? See these little circles? So that's the remaining forest in this whole swath of pretty desperate agricultural land. And so the last remaining forests in northern Ethiopia is less than 5% of the land. And here's how one of those little green dots looks up close. And now you can probably see the church in the middle. Can you see that round roof, which is the church? So that's the Coptic church where the priest lives and all his disciples. But out here, you can see how the boundaries are getting really decayed. The cattle come in and eat the trees and the seedlings. The farmer, not surprisingly, plows really close because he's so desperate to get an extra row of millet. And the kids sometimes see these trees on the edge looking a little dry, and so they cut them down for mom's wood stove. And so these church forests, as they're called, are shrinking, and we've been able to measure the fact that in the next decade, they're about to lose these if something isn't done about this. And so why should we really care? What's important about it? So a couple things. First of all, I went originally to Ethiopia to survey the biodiversity. So here's the kind of stuff that we found in the forest canopy there. Looks a little bit unexciting, but a lot of new species. That's a really handsome mite, isn't it? It's named after me. It's the Lowman mite. It is so ugly. My mother was horrified, but that's what scientists do for each other. Sometimes we name things after each other. Anyway, we have all these new species, which is all well and good, but when you think about this, what good is discovering biodiversity? What good is measuring carbon? What good is really measuring tree growth in a country where they really don't have any kind of benefit from having a list of species, and they really need fresh water, but they really need crops, and they really need some level of understanding of their natural world. So I had to really retool my brain to work in Ethiopia because we need different outcomes and we need different processes in order to achieve success in a country like this. It's not good enough for us to use our own values for success here. And here is one of the amazing successes is the kids. There's no field guides. There's no Henry David Thoreau that you read about in high school saying, you know, I go to nature because nature's so inspiring. So the kids don't grow up with any understanding of what lives in their ecosystems, and they'd never seen the ants and the spiders and the beetles living in their trees. So they were these amazing sponges, so excited to learn about the species, but yet it's so frustrating because they don't have a textbook or a computer or any way that we can leave them the knowledge with their schools or their teachers. So challenge number one, how to relate to the next generation of priests, but success number two is that they really are excited about learning about their own nature. So we have these amazing, wonderful, willing field assistants, but we've got to figure out how to give them the tools that might sustain this kind of knowledge. The second thing is just outright saving these little bits of forest that exist right now. And to do that, we have to act within the next year or two. And that's really quick in the world of science, where we usually design things and it takes a decade. So here I am with my Coptic priest workshop, my colleague and I, who is an Ethiopian colleague, which is really, really important for a project like this, decided that we needed to share those Google Earth images with the priests so they would see how their forests are shrinking. And so we did that. This is the master church hall. You can see how rough it is. We rented a generator. We got a sheet. We showed the program of the Google Earth images on this sheet with this generator. It was a miracle that it worked. Duct taped the generator wire several times. And lo and behold, the priests were amazed. They had no idea that most of their country was subsistence agriculture. They thought it was all forest like the surrounds of their churches. So they immediately said, we would like to help. And on their own volition, they figured out that they could collect the stones out of the fields, help the farmers with their crop yield and build these beautiful walls that would protect these remaining forests. So we now have a program to wall the 28 most critical and most biodiverse forests in Ethiopia with these stone walls, and we're halfway there. So it's very exciting. I was just there in January, and there were about 8 new walls going up, and to fund a gift to the church to inspire the priests to do this, I've been selling the names of our new species. So we have auctions online. If you want to get a mite, name it after your girlfriend, come and join one of my auctions. She'll love you forever. We might even get a nematode or even a beetle if you're lucky, but we've been doing creative things like this to fundraise, to remind the priests about how important this project is. So the really neat thing is we now have, oops, that was my list, these church forests, they're getting walls, and the most important part about this conservation project is that it's religion and science working together, but now it's a culture change. The priests all want walls, and the parishioners, the people who attend the church, really love the walls around their church. They've been telling us, now our church has clothing. They are so happy about that. So it is the same goal in the end. I want to conserve biodiversity. They want to conserve all of God's creatures. So it's a great partnership. It's just one that isn't deployed too often because we still have this feeling that religion and science don't go together. So those are just case studies. Students can help, women can help, religion can help, education can help. There's a whole lot of ways we can take our science and weave it into something more than just the science itself. So I just want to close by highlighting your nearby museum, which is the Nature Research Center in Raleigh that I had such a privilege of helping to construct and fundraise for and then hire the staff. That's an awesome place to communicate science out of this daily planet. Have any of you been there? Raise your hand if you've been there. It's a pretty cool thing. If you go to down on Jones Street in Raleigh, right across from the state government, which is a very key location, you can talk in this thing about some issue that might be very important for your politicians to hear about. So keep that in mind too. And in this setting, the whole state has the opportunity to hear about cutting edge science and really change the needle for you guys in North Carolina. So don't overlook that opportunity. And if you're faculty, I would be asking if you could bring your students there and give reports on different issues that are important in North Carolina, because from the mouths of students come the truth, and I think politicians listen to them more than they might listen to us old scientist codgers. But anyway, the same thing is now happening in the West Coast. I got recruited by San Francisco to please try to replicate the Nature Research Center out at the California Academy of Science. And our mission at the Cal Academy is explore, explain, and sustain life on Earth. That's the big one. Not just discover it, not just publish it, but how are you going to keep it? So that big piece at the end is really where I think science is going right now. How can we sustain these systems that keep us alive? Anybody been to the California Academy of Sciences in Golden Gate Park? Oh, just a couple. Anyone comes out there, please ask for me. Just ask for the tree lady, they'll find me. Or ask for the monkey woman or whatever you like. But anyway, again, I was mentioning this as a little tiny vignette on the world of science, but when I came there, we had only 2 women scientists, and now we have more, thankfully. We have about 100 on the staff, and so we had this abysmal ratio with very few role models for a lot of the grad students. But we have 46 million things in our collections. We have these extraordinary things like the Galapagos tortoises and Darwin's finches. So really and truly, I'd love to show you if you want to come out. And I kind of mentioned these 2 museums because the museum world is exploding with new jobs. And you guys might want to know this. The world of academia is declining with new jobs, but China's opening up a museum a day. I get calls all the time from Vietnam, Cambodia, China. Would you please come over and advise us how to set up our museum? There are going to be amazing jobs in museums, and we're just adding to our workforce big time because so many people look to museums for their science education. America has figured out that unfortunately, kids don't get their science education in K through 12, but they do get it with this thing called informal science education. So by creating venues in museums, you can really, really make a huge difference in a kid's life by offering both science education and science research all in one. So at the Cal Academy, we have an indoor rainforest, not surprising because most kids in the US haven't seen a rainforest. We have an indoor coral reef, which is totally amazing and gives kids a real chance to think about how cool would it be to be a coral reef biologist. You can see them right there actually feeding the fish. And we have a lot of scientists who tell their stories. And the same kind of thing is happening right next door in Raleigh. This is my student who studies sloths and monkeys in the canopy, because with our methods now, we can do things like this that we never could do 10 or 20 years ago. And of course, field biologists do all sorts of crazy things, like try to take vehicles across large rivers in Madagascar. But aside from the risk, it's a really fun career. So I just thought you might like to think about the museum world as a potential option for you. And I think in science in general, we're all moving toward this kind of mission where our science needs to be applicable to global problems. So what? Does it matter or not? And even if you're little, like these third graders that are working with me on an invasive bromeliad in Florida, or if you're bigger, like these students who are doing projects in oak trees in Kansas, and we discovered 8 new species last summer. So there are so many opportunities for all of you. Oh, these are the species we discovered. Anybody know what this is? Quiz. Yes, aren't they cute? Oh my gosh, I have a soft spot for them, but they're cool because there's so many species to be discovered and they're so tough. So just think about it. They've gone to outer space and back, and that's pretty cool. So if nothing else, you can go to the canopy and find all these amazing critters that are really weird and really different from most other parts of the planet. So in closing, I just want to say that I really think we need to work so hard together to engage that 51% of the planet, many of whom are still disenfranchised from science. Canopies have been, for me, a little hook to get to kids, as well as priests, as well as students, and for you in your career, regardless if it's business or chemistry or dentistry or whatever, I know that you will develop ways to share your knowledge with the next generation and also think about making sure that it has some level of global good. So with that, I thought I'd just close with the last 2 sentences from my book, because I've actually learned a lot more about people as a scientist than I probably have about biodiversity. And so this is kind of what I've learned, and hopefully you will discover the same thing in your life. One of the most meaningful insights that I have acquired along my life's journey is that it takes the same amount of energy to complain as it does to exclaim, but the results are incredibly different. Learning to exclaim instead of to complain has been my most valuable lesson. So thank you very much for listening.